Joining us now, though, is Ambassador Chase Untermeyer, and he was ambassador to the state of Qatar for the United States during the Bush administration from 2004 to 2007. He's also a Harvard graduate. He's a founding member, the founding chairman and member of the Qatar America Institute. He served in Vietnam on a Navy destroyer in the Asian Pacific. At the time, he was a naval officer. He's got quite the resume. Now, here's what we have in common. He was a reporter for the Houston Chronicle. Get this. So, like me, came from journalism. And I'm going to hope when I talk to him here in a few seconds, I'm going to hope that he's an Astros fan like I am, because how do you be in Houston and work for the Chronicle like I did and not be an Astro fan, right? Back in the Astrodome days, back in the, I go way back to forget Bagwell and BG. I go back to Jose Cruz. I go back to Larry Durker. I go back to Jimmy Wynn, Rusty Staub. Oh, man, don't want to say how old I am. I go way back. And he also was a member of the Texas House of Representatives. And he was an assistant secretary of the Navy, and he's also served as executive assistant to Vice President George H. Bush in 1981 after he left the Texas House of Representatives. And he is with us now, Ambassador Chase Untermeyer. Mr. Ambassador, great to have you.
Good morning, John. Thank you for having me on your show.
Okay, so I got to start with baseball, sir. Opening day is Thursday. I'm a lifetime 55-year Astro fan. What do you think?
Well, I'm very impressed that the Astros are well represented in the far east of the United States by yourself. And,
I know. I'm a one-man gang, Mr. Ambassador. I love my Astros. I watch almost every game, and I follow them. I don't think I've missed a box score since I'm about 7 years old, and I'm 61. Even when they were losing 100 and 110 games a season, I'm like such a diehard. But I'm excited about this season. Always excited, sir, for opening day. Okay, let's get into some of the meat here, sir, and thanks for being with us. Mr. Ambassador, this week, the government, the state of Qatar, the emir and the government, said they were going to stop recognizing and supporting Hamas. Tell us what that means.
Well, I'm not sure about that recognizing. I think they're still going to have some kind of political connection with them. What happened is that Qatar has been a major aid donor to Gaza, which has, of course, been ruled by Hamas since 2006, and largely because the government of Gaza is so inept and so focused on its political military aim vis-a-vis Israel that it is an unreliable, in fact, inept partner in doing any kind of reconstruction of that place. You could say that the people of Gaza are like the people of Venezuela. They are the victims of their own government. And Qatar, like a lot of other Arab donors, frankly don't trust the Palestinians. They talk about them politically, they clutch their heart and tell about how much they've been abused, but they really don't like them and they don't trust them. So you never see cash going from one place to Gaza. You see aid projects. And in this case, Qatar had over 100 aid projects of various sorts to rebuild schools and housing and health clinics, that sort of thing. And they just stopped it because they had no partner in progress.
So basically, the aid that the state of Qatar was sending into Gaza was going through Hamas. What you're saying is they just figured, look, it's being intercepted. It's not going for the reason we sent it. And so that's why they said we've just had it with that.
Well, I'm not sure if by intercepted you meant cash, because
yes.
Given that distrust I mentioned, they've never just outright written a check.
Right.
And instead spend it well. Qatar has control of the contracts, but you still need the cooperation of local authorities in order to do any good anywhere, and that's what's been frustrating. And what Qatar has done is say, okay, United Nations, you do it.
Right.
Well, I say to the UN, lots of luck.
right?
Because they're going to run into the same kind of problem of trying to make any kind of progress given the state of government there.
When the Gang of Four initiated the blockade, the embargo on Qatar, Bahrain, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, when they initiated the blockade, part of their reasons, I mean, the demands they had were totally asinine. Anybody that follows it knows that. But one of the things that they were claiming, and they kind of convinced the White House there for a short period of time, that the state of Qatar, the government, was funding terrorists. Hamas was one of those organizations that was brought up. Does this decision, Mr. Ambassador, change any of the dynamics or the thinking now on that?
Well, it should serve as an argument against those who have claimed that the state of Qatar has been, quote, supporting Hamas. What Qatar has tried to do is support the people of Gaza who are ruled or misruled by Hamas. The allegation that Qatar trucks with terrorists is ridiculous because it is a conservative monarchy in the Gulf, not unlike Abu Dhabi or Dubai or, for that matter, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. They're not in the business of fomenting radical Islam. It's not in their interest, let alone the interest of the rest of the world. So what is it? What is going on, and what has been the case, is that Qatar has political ties to not just Hamas, but to Hezbollah, to the Taliban, to the Muslim Brotherhood, and this it does in order to maintain connections in places where, like it or not, those forces are in control. And that being the case, the Saudis and the Emiratis in particular are very upset, and that is why they have raised the allegation that Qatar trucks with terrorists.
But now that has really proven to be false when you try to dig under it. I know that the original White House and Trump administration reaction to it was to go with the Saudis' original charges, but then cooler heads have prevailed, and now the administration has really backed off that. The Emir's been there 2 times, and that's kind of gone by the wayside. The blockade that the Gang of Four did has economically backfired. I mean, it's been of no value to them, and actually many people say that the state of Qatar is actually economically better off since the blockade than they were in the Gulf previous to that. Is there except for the humanitarian crisis, because people can't move freely between countries in the Gulf the way they could in the past, so families are split up and property's not recognized, students couldn't go back to school and all that, which is all bad. Do you see an end in sight for this?
No end in sight, although I do have a notion of how it will end whenever it does end, and that is it will be done quietly, largely because, as you say, it has been such an embarrassing failure. Qatar is a small, very rich country. It did wobble a bit after the imposition of the blockade, but since then it was able to leverage its immense financial resources, for example, its 200 aircraft airline, to bring in food and other essentials that had been kept out by the Saudi blockade. They bring in food from Turkey by way of Iran, which is another issue we can discuss. But the fact is that the blockade has been so embarrassing that I don't believe we'll see a conference of brotherly embrace and signing of a document to end it. It'll just kind of dribble out.
So basically, the Saudis who are the ringleaders here, they don't want to participate, and MBS doesn't want to participate, Mohammed bin Salman, in some kind of high-profile peace agreement because he would be embarrassed by the outcome, and so it'll just kind of melt away, is what you're saying.
Yes, the sooner the better. It's just that there's no evidence that that's coming anytime soon.
Right. Well, time will tell, no doubt. You're on the John Fredericks Radio Network. We are with former Qatar ambassador Chase Untermeyer. He was ambassador with the U.S. ambassador to the state of Qatar between 2004.
2007.
Right, 2004 and 2007. Apologize for that. 2004 and 2007. Let's get to the war in Yemen. I know being in that region, being ambassador for that period of time, you understand that region. That a complete nightmare now. We can't seem to get any closure to that. The Saudis involved in that. The U.S. saying they're going to stop supplying the planes. But I talked to a former U.S. commander out there just a week ago, Mr. Ambassador, who said that the United States really what they were doing was simply providing logistics to the Saudis and refueling their planes in the air. And he said even if the U.S. withdrew, that just wouldn't matter that much. And he didn't see an end in sight to this. What about you?
It is a proxy war between the Saudis and the Iranians, or if you want to put it, the great Sunni power versus the great Shia power. Mm-hmm. And for that reason alone, it's a matter of most intense importance to the Saudis and Mohammed bin Salman in particular. It just happens to be played out in a country that is tragically cursed by so many things. We have to remember, incidentally, that Yemen is a very large country. It's not very large physically, but it has a population roughly the size of Saudi Arabia or Texas, that is in excess of 25 million people. It's a country that's exceedingly poor, and because, so many words, the population is clocked out after about 2 o'clock because of the national obsession with a narcotic called khat. It is a country that is unable to function as a country. And that's even before we get into the sectarian and geographic divisions of the country that relate to this larger struggle between Iran and Saudi Arabia.
Mr. Ambassador, can you elaborate on the statement you just made, clocked out at 2 p.m. because of this narcotic? Can you explain that, sir?
Yes, the only efficient thing that's done in all of Yemen is the harvesting, distribution, and sale of this narcotic called khat. And a further tragedy to the country is that as a plant, khat is heavily dependent upon water, and it soaks up what little water resource there is in this entire country, in a nation that many people think is going to absolutely dry up, be the first nation of any size, let alone large size, to be totally without water in the space of the next 10 to 20 years. In any event, the people for years have relied upon khat to forget the dread of their daily lives, and that's why essentially nothing happens in that country after noon. Unbelievable.
Sir, the state of Qatar has often talked about enabling Yemen to get into the GCC. Obviously, there's a dispute now with the blockade. The Saudis normally not interested in that. Do you ever see a time where Yemen might enter the Gulf Cooperation Council?
You know, the Gulf Cooperation Council, which isn't necessarily related to the body of water called the Gulf, but is just an agglomeration of countries in that part of the world, is wounded, possibly mortally wounded by this blockade. That is, given the length of the blockade and the intensity of feeling and the fact that, frankly, part of the GCC, namely the Saudis, Emiratis, and Bahrainis, were out to get another member, namely Qatar, means that the divisions are pretty deep and abiding. It will surprise me if the GCC functions as an organization of any consequence in the future, and therefore whether Yemen is a member or any other state is a member is just a paper distinction rather than anything meaningful.
Right, because basically the GCC, because of the blockade, is not what it was. I mean, there is no cooperation going on.
Exactly,
yeah,
no cooperating, and for that matter, no organization.
Let's get to the Trump administration's, the President Trump's decision to recognize the Golan Heights as part of Israel after a 52-year period where basically the Israeli government controlled 2/3 of the Golan Heights since the 1967 war. Only 50,000 Syrians now live there. Most of them have gotten out over that 52-year period of time. But the reaction across the Arab world to this has really shocked me because it really nothing has changed. And what the president has said is, look, they've controlled it for 5 decades. I'm just going to recognize it. Militarily and strategically, it's critical, especially as we're withdrawing troops from Syria because it's the high ground. Why the reaction?
Well, I will speak for myself. I can't talk to others.
Yes, sir.
The issue goes beyond the basic security question, which is why Israel occupied the Golan Heights in 1967. That is because from the heights, the kibbutzim and other settlements along the valley were under the threat of Syrian guns. So there was a perfect strategic reason why Israel is there. The question goes beyond that to really one of 2 things. One is, if there is ever to be some kind of settlement between Israel and the Palestinians, the issue of recognizing the status of the Golan Heights would be most key to that, just like the status of Jerusalem. And we're told that we have a master negotiator in the White House. I just wonder about such tactics as moving the U.S. Embassy and recognizing Israeli sovereignty in the Golan as giving away 2 things that in a negotiation with Palestinians you would want to hold out to the Israelis as reasons to compromise on something of value to the Palestinians. Well, the likelihood of having that kind of discussion is very little nowadays, and we have 2 less bargaining chips. So that's one way of looking at it. A much more serious way of looking at it, again, having nothing to do with the facts on the ground militarily, is that the United States and all the Western world condemned the Russian occupation of Crimea in 2014. And in that case, at least the Russians had the argument that there were Russian-speaking people who wanted to be part of Russia living in Crimea. Nevertheless, it was legally a part of another country, namely Ukraine. That was condemned correctly. And in this case, we seem to be saying that it's all right then for a country to occupy and to absorb another country. In this case, in the case of Golan, as you pointed out, there are really no people living there. So you could say it strengthens the Russian argument that they were right in occupying Crimea. And that is a very serious concession.
We're with former U.S. ambassador to the state of Qatar, Chase Untermeyer. He was also former Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Vietnam veteran, Harvard grad, and founding chairman of the Qatar America Institute. I've only got a couple more minutes, Mr. Ambassador. Basically, on the Golan Heights situation, as I understand it, you see 2 major issues. One, the hypocrisy as it relates to the Crimean Russian situation, and secondly, the fact that along with Jerusalem moving the embassy, the president has now given up 2 key bargaining chips for obtaining any sense of peace with the Israel-Palestinian situation. Is that about right, the way I summed it up?
Yes, on the bargaining chip question, I wouldn't use the word hypocrisy. This is a serious counter to our justified concern about what Russia did in Crimea. If we, in effect, are saying it's quite all right if a country, for whatever reason, decides to invade and absorb another piece of territory belonging to another country, that is what concerns me, and the Russians are going to be quick to take advantage of it, I am sure. No doubt, they always do. I want to get to economics. We've only got a couple more minutes. The company in Qatar called Qatar Petroleum and ExxonMobil
they just inked an agreement to begin construction of what they call the Golden Pass Terminal. This is on the Texas Gulf Coast. Obviously, you're very familiar with that, being from Texas. And Qatar Petroleum is investing $10 billion. What they're saying, what Exxon is saying, is this investment, along with Qatar Petroleum, is going to create 45,000 full-time jobs in America, and it's going to generate $35 billion in economic activity. Those are pretty big numbers. How did this, first of all, is that accurate? Second of all, do you think it's the right move, sir?
Yes, well, first of all, the Golden Pass Terminal has been on the ground since about 2008. Mm-hmm. It was built to import liquefied natural gas from Qatar, but just about the time they unloaded the first shipment, the vast amounts of gas in places like South Texas and Ohio, Pennsylvania were discovered, which makes the United States now a gas exporter. Mm-hmm. So what the announcement you cited is going to do is to reverse that terminal, turn it into an export facility, and the Qataris are perfectly happy with that. They own about 70% of it, and ExxonMobil will manage it. That's going to take several years to do, and that's, I believe, what's driving those numbers of employment.
All right, so all in all, it's a good thing, but it's amazing that in that period of time, since its inception to now, that it went from, okay, this is where the United States is going to import natural gas in, to now, with all of our own findings, where we're going to export natural gas out. And it sounds like Qatar Petroleum has invested $10 billion with Exxon in order to make this happen. So not only is the U.S. energy independent, but we're now a net exporter of oil, and also a net exporter, I would think now, right, of liquefied natural gas also.
There are many terminals on the Texas-Louisiana coast for the purpose of exporting LNG. That's a very, very positive development for our country.
All right, Mr. Ambassador, we're out of time. I really want to thank you for your time today. Very informative conversation, and I really appreciate your analysis of the Golan Heights situation, sir. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, John. It was a pleasure.
Former ambassador to the state of Qatar, Chase Untermeyer, also former Navy veteran, naval officer on a destroyer during the Vietnam War, Harvard grad, and also assistant Navy secretary, and a former reporter. See, this is what gets me, for the Houston Chronicle. So we're going to end this by saying, go Astros. Mr. Ambassador, have a great day. John Fredericks Radio Network.